Out on a warm spring evening for a change. My name's Eric Owens, and I'm the Associate Director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life. I'll be your host for this evening, and I want to thank Yael and Mary for all their work they did putting this together here on our staff at the Boise Center, and let you know that the Boise Center has two other terrific events coming up in the next few weeks. One on Thursday evening about business ethics in Saudi Arabia, and another on April 24th, a panel on American healthcare reform featuring three senior corporate business executives and a theological ethicist discussing business ethics and American healthcare reform. So come join us for those events as well. A special welcome to those watching us online tonight on the internet. This is broadcast live from our friends at Front Row, and those of you who are sitting on your couches eating peanut butter or chips or whatever, thank you for taking the time to be with us as well. I ask that those in the room silence your cell phones, please, so that we're not disrupted. But you don't have to put them away, because we will be live tweeting this event at #BostonHope, which you see down here as well. So those of you watching from home or across the ocean will be able to tweet about it, and also tweet questions that we can raise to the speaker at the conclusion of his lecture. As is our custom for these, we'll leave time at the end of the lecture for plenty of conversation, and I know that that's a key part of what Professor Krause would like as well. Tonight's event is one of many events, exhibits, and memorials around the city and here at Boston College, memorializing the anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombings. And I'll just mention a couple that I think might be useful. I know that there are many more that I'm not aware of, but I hope that you'll all be a part of this conversation over the next few weeks. Many of you know at Boston College last fall, students and faculty and members of the community planted over 3,500 daffodil bulbs that have started to come up now, timed to arise around this time of year, right before the runners will pass by. And take special mention of those as you walk across campus, and especially along Comm Ave. Next week, the sophomore class of Presidential Scholars at Boston College will launch a new project that they're entitling Strong Month, April 15th to May 15th. And it's designed to help us think about the nature and the source of our real strengths as a community. So you can learn more about that at strongmonth.org. And downtown at the Copley branch, the main branch of the Boston Public Library, there's a new exhibition called Dear Boston, Messages from the Marathon Memorial, running through May 11th. And it features items from the makeshift memorial that took place on the police barricades and then in Copley Square later on. It's a very powerful exhibition, and I encourage you to head down. Obviously, it will be busy on the day of the marathon, but it'll be up for the next month or so. There are many more such events, and I hope that you'll all be a part of them. 1 year ago next week, on April 15th, 2013, 2 bombs exploded at the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 spectators, including 8-year-old Martin Richard, and injuring nearly 265 others. There was death and destruction, but also an incredible combination of talent, speed, grit, and hospitality that burst forth that day, saving hundreds from what might have been lethal wounds. At the Interfaith Memorial Service, held 3 days later, Governor Deval Patrick implored citizens not to lose touch with our spiritual faith or our civic faith, and to rise and endure, he said, to have accountability without vengeance, vigilance without fear. That very evening, an MIT police officer was killed in a series of events, quickly leading to a full-scale manhunt that shut down public transit and stopped trains in and out of the city. Paramilitary, armored vehicles patrolled Watertown, and the rest of the city was told to shelter in place for an entire day as thousands of law enforcement officials searched the region. The perpetrators were trapped on the night of the 19th, and as we all know, one died in the midst of a shootout, and the other was apprehended and currently awaits trial. Together, these events left an indelible mark on this city, the mark of terrorism, which our speaker this evening knows all too well. It's a complicated legacy that can shape and be shaped in many ways, good and bad. Professor Krause is Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Boston College. His research and writing focuses on international security, Middle East politics, political violence, and national movements. He's conducted extensive fieldwork throughout the Middle East over the past 5 years, and is working on a book about the political effectiveness of national movements, and articles about the impact of education on attitudes about terrorism and counterterrorism. Professor Krause is a research affiliate with the MIT Security Studies program, and he's appeared as an analyst of Middle East politics, political violence, in the Boston Marathon attacks with a number of local and national media outlets. We invited Professor Krause to give this lecture very soon after reading a stirring letter that he wrote to the editor of the BC student newspaper, The Heights, on April 16, 2013. One of the most common ways terrorist attacks backfire, he wrote at the time, is when the communities they aim to frighten respond not with the fear or infighting, but rather with resilience and resolve to strengthen their social bonds beyond what they were before the attack. People often ask me, Professor Krause wrote, what average citizens can do in response to terrorism. Well, here's your answer. Make sure that next year's Boston Marathon has more participants and spectators than any other in history. The people who carried out these attacks must be tracked down and punished by law enforcement, he continues. But we as a society get to decide if the attacks have a broader social impact. We get to decide if we respond to these terrible acts with fear and hatred or with renewed community spirit. Continuing, he says at the end, I hate to run, and I have never run more than 5 miles in my entire life. He might have been speaking for me at that point. But I'm running the Boston Marathon next year, he said, and I'm raising money to send to the victims of this tragedy and the first responders who prevented an even greater one. Who is with me, he said as he closed. Well, we're with you, Peter, and we look forward to your talk tonight, which is entitled Terrorism and the Boston Marathon, Fear, Hope, and Resilience.
Thank you so much to Eric and to the Boise Center for the invitation, for that wonderful welcome. Thank you to all of you guys for coming here tonight. It's a great honor to speak before you. As Eric mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the political science department here at Boston College. And this time last year, I'd actually finished teaching my seminar in terrorism and political violence in the fall, and I was happily teaching Introduction to International Studies to the entire sophomore class of that program for the very first time. I only teach about terrorism for 1 week out of the 15 weeks in that course. And if you can believe it, the week that was scheduled last spring to teach about terrorism was April 15th through 19th. Little did I know that as my students were reading abstract theories about the causes and effects of terrorism on Marathon Monday, they were about to be faced with the reality of attacks in their own backyard. I live on the Boston Marathon route, and I had watched the race for an hour or two with my wife before heading into the office to finish grading an exam and to prepare my lecture on the causes of terrorism for the next day. After receiving a call from my wife about explosions near the finish line and watching the news unfold from my McGuinn office over the next couple of hours, I decided that I wanted to reach out to the BC community with a letter in the hope that some of the knowledge on terrorism and political violence that I had gained over the past decade could provide some degree of understanding and comfort to those who saw the attacks as incomprehensible and terrifying. The themes of fear, hope, and resilience that I raised in my letter to the Heights on the day of the attacks are the same themes I'd like to talk to you about today. What is terrorism and what causes it? Why does it inspire such fear in people? And how can we best cope with that fear? What is the strategic logic of terrorism? And what can those who employ it actually hope to achieve? Is there any hope for us to latch onto amidst what seem to be daily reports on terrorist attacks around the world? What can we do in response to such violence, and what is effective community resilience? These are some of the many questions I plan to address today in the course of my talk, which will blend findings from my own and others' research on both terrorism in general and the Boston Marathon attacks in particular. In the short time I have tonight, I can only begin to touch on each of these questions, which is why I especially look forward to our discussion after the talk to analyze some of these issues in greater depth. So let's start with that first question. What exactly is terrorism? If we're going to talk about this concept, as any good political scientist or scholar in general would want to do, we want to make sure we have a good definition of it. What you're seeing here is actually a word cloud. Students who take my seminar on terrorism and political violence have to send me their own definition of terrorism a week or so before they actually arrive in the first class. What the word cloud represents are basically the words they use in their definition. The larger the word, the more students who actually use that in their definition of terrorism. Now, right off the bat, I said to them, look, you guys get an A in the class because what is the main theme coming out of it? Political violence, and the name of the class is Terrorism and Political Violence. So seemingly, they got a good idea about what terrorism is about. But obviously, we see not just consensus here. We see many other words, groups, civilians, individuals, use, change, achieve, non-state. Some of these words are certainly contested. And I'm not going to tell you that there's only one definition of terrorism. In fact, if you look at how politicians use the word terrorism, it oftentimes means the people they don't like, the bad guys, the other side. What I'm here to tell you, though, is that in academia, at least, we often do employ a more kind of standard objective form for how we actually define terrorism. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that this is making a normative claim. Myself or other academics who are defining terrorism this way are not saying that terrorism is terrible and other types of violence are somehow better. In fact, anyone who looks at the history of violence in the world could not help but admit that states have killed orders of magnitude more people and more civilians than non-state actors ever have. That being said, as social scientists, we're often trying to explain and understand phenomena, and many times we want to group them by their similarities. If I try to look at state violence in the same study that I look at non-state violence, they're so different in some sense in terms of their institutions and their power and the norms that they follow, that in some sense the findings I'm going to have aren't going to be necessarily very sophisticated. So instead, we define things a bit more exact, and we say, look, terrorism is the use or threat of violence by a non-state group against non-combatants to inspire fear or alarm in an audience beyond the immediate target for political ends. And if we break that down, we see the definition has these 5 components. If it's missing any one of those 5 components of the definition, it might be crime, it might be insurgency, it might be state conflict, but it's not terrorism according to this definition. Now, the thing that I want to focus on, the first theme that comes out of the letter that I wrote and that I want to talk to you today is fear. When we talk about terrorism, one of the things that makes it unique from, say, other types of crime or other types of violence is that it's not just targeted at the individual who's the target of the violence, who's the person who's killed or attacked. It goes and is meant to extend beyond that individual to inspire fear in a broader community. That's one of the main purposes of terrorism. If we look at terrorism and why people are afraid of it, it's very interesting. One of the studies that I'm currently conducting with Professor Leanne Young, who's in the psychology department, is to look at students around the United States, not just at BC but elsewhere, and try to understand how big of a threat they think terrorism is, how fearful they are of a terrorist attack. One of the interesting things is that all of them see it to themselves as at least a medium threat on average, and they see it as a large threat to the United States. This is before they've taken a class on terrorism, by the way. That'll be important later. If we look at polls across the United States, say this Gallup poll, 79% of Americans feel that terrorism is either an extremely serious or very serious threat. When you combine those two together, that is higher than any of these other issues that we talk about all the time as being major threats to the American way of life, security, etc. The federal debt, unemployment, the environment. Terrorism beats all of them in terms of how Americans perceive threats to themselves and to their nation. Now, I put disproportion up here in the sense that, as we'll talk about a little bit later, it's not exactly clear that terrorism merits this degree of fear, but we'll talk about a little about why that is. If we think about why we're scared of things and why terrorism might be a particularly fearful threat, I think there's a couple reasons for it. First is it's seemingly an unknown issue in the sense that you don't necessarily know who the attacker is. You're a victim of violence by someone you've never met before. You're not sure exactly why they're doing it. It's cloaked in kind of a cloak, for lack of a better word, of unknowingness, of not knowing exactly who did it. In terms of it being uncontrollable, people often will say, well, I am okay with a risk if I know that I'm the one who's taking that on. If you drive behind the wheel of a car, you're likely to perhaps get in an accident someday, right? But you feel like you have some degree of control because you chose to get inside that car. You're the one who's actually driving the steering wheel, even if someone else crashes into you. With a terrorist attack, there's some feeling of, yeah, not only do I not know where it's coming from, but I can't control it. I can't go to safe or unsafe neighborhoods or take actions that make me more or less protected to a large extent. And so in that sense, it's also something that I'm a bit scared of. Furthermore, it's also to some extent indiscriminate, in the sense that when we look at terrorist attacks a lot of the time, it's kind of killing anyone in a given geographical area, regardless of whether you're a good or bad person, or whether you're from a certain religious group or ethnicity or whatever else. Now, to be clear, a lot of terrorist attacks do target people based on some of these standards. But within a certain idea of someone in this state or someone at this marketplace on that particular day, it's indiscriminate. And so that sense, the idea that, oh, that could have been me. I could have been at the Boston Marathon finish line that day. I could see myself there. That makes it both something that we're more fearful of, as well as an attack that we're oftentimes more identifying with. Now, if we think about lone wolves is a term that we use sometimes in the media, with politicians, or with academics. This is a term that refers to people who are not part of any formal organization. to be clear, the vast majority of terrorist attacks internationally are driven and controlled by organizations. But there are individuals who seemingly spring up. Either they're inspired by something they see on the internet, or a fight they hear about far away, or something that happens to them personally, and they launch an attack even though they don't have any training or any orders from any broader armed organization. If we look at a couple lone wolves here, we've got someone like the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, Anders Breivik, who launched brutal attacks around Oslo, and Jahar Tsarnaev, again, one of the bombers in the Boston Marathon. One of the reasons that lone wolves are oftentimes extra fearful or extra scary to people in general is because of the fact that they're not part of a given organization. So for the intelligence community or for individuals, they're harder to identify beforehand, they're harder to stop, and so in that sense, again, they kind of increase this idea of something that's unknown and potentially uncontrollable, and so again, it scares us even a bit more. Now, if we look at attacks inside the United States pre and post the Oklahoma City bombings, which, by the way, was another major attack launched by a lone wolf, Timothy McVeigh, we actually see that people who are afraid of lone wolves actually have some data behind that. The percentage of attacks before the Oklahoma City bombings that actually came from individuals, only about 6 or 7%. Whereas post-95, again, recognize, even though it looks much larger, it's still not the majority of attacks. So still the majority of attacks in the United States are emanating from organizations. But the percentage, relatively, that have been launched by individuals that aren't part of any group has skyrocketed since 1995. So lone wolves are particularly a major security issue today in the United States. All right. Now, when we think about the causes of violence, why people might actually commit these attacks, let's have a little multiple choice quiz. And I want you to call out here, but let's look at this for a moment. Most individuals who commit terrorist attacks are mentally ill, poor, uneducated, both mentally ill and poor, or all of the above. Raise your hand if you think the answer is A. B. Okay, couple. Oh, a couple more. Okay, people are afraid to raise their hands. C. D. Okay, a bunch more. E. Oh, you think it's just all the above. Well, the answer is actually, sorry, it's a trick question. This is one of those professor tricks, right? None is the actually correct answer. Again, all of these things are somewhat disputed in the literature, but generally, the vast majority of people who commit terrorist attacks are not mentally ill, nor are they poor, nor are they uneducated. These are often myths we talk about within the scholarly community who studies terrorism, basically saying, look, a lot of the time if someone commits an attack, people say, oh, you know, that person has had mental challenges, or they're doing it because they have nothing to live for, because they're very poor. When you look at the record, that's often not the case. Now, let's actually talk about some of the causes that we do find good evidence for. One of the ways to think about it is at various levels of analysis, from individuals to the groups they're often part of, all the way up to the broader strategic community, the movements that they often consider themselves part of. So if we start at the individual level, it's not so much one's level of education or poverty or whatever else. Oftentimes, it's social ostracism. Someone who feels they're ostracized from the community, they don't have friends, they don't fit in, they don't have people who kind of make them happy day to day or feel like they have strong social bonds with. Those are often individuals who are launching these types of attacks. Or they could be individuals who are seeking revenge or have been humiliated. Maybe someone who saw his or her mom or dad, slapped at a checkpoint amidst a military occupation or something like this. They feel that they're humiliated, they feel like they need to strike back, and so this can be one of the individual causes of why someone might launch a terrorist attack. Going up the levels of analysis to the organization. This is something I would say of the three that most Americans and people who don't study terrorism think about the least. When there's attack in the United States, people either say, oh, this is someone who's mentally ill or someone who has their own personal problems, or they say, oh yeah, it's about occupation or war or something like this. They often don't look at this area, which is very interesting because if we think about why the United States is surging in Afghanistan, we might say, well, some of it's because President Obama was concerned that drawing down Iraq would leave him open to charges of being weak on the domestic front. So what did he have to do? He had to say, well, there is a good war, it's Afghanistan, we're going to send more troops in there to, again, show domestically amidst elections, etc., that I'm still strong on terrorism, that I still have a strong foreign policy. What's interesting to think about is that terrorist attacks often operate in a similar fashion. There are often multiple groups who are competing for recruits, for notoriety, for money, and they launch these attacks to kind of prove their revolutionary bona fides, to show that they're not just all talk. They're actually willing to take costly action for the broader cause, and so therefore drive up their political power. This happens all the time in terms of launching attacks, but it's something we often don't pay attention to. Finally, at kind of the highest level of analysis, we do have things like military occupation, which often leads to political violence and terrorism against the military forces or their civilians. We also see things like discrimination, where you're discriminating against a given ethnic group, or you can see even just war itself. If we think about the origins of al-Qaeda, where did al-Qaeda come from? It emerged out of a conflict in Afghanistan between vast majority local native Afghans and Soviet forces and some Afghans who fought on their side. But then you also had what were called the Arab Afghans, individuals coming from abroad, wanting to fight as what they saw a broader struggle, defending the Ummah, the broader Muslim community, against the Soviets. But then after the fact, people who also had training, had experience, and some of them said, where's kind of the next big fight in the struggle? What can I do now? That's where al-Qaeda emerges from. And if you look at Syria today, unfortunately, you see many groups who are, again, kind of glomming onto a broader civil war for their own purposes and potentially leading to attacks elsewhere in the aftermath. Okay. Going forward with the idea of fear, if we think about strategies of terrorism, fear is actually a key component in every single one. First, talking about attrition. What is attrition? Attrition as a strategy basically means you are trying to impose high levels of economic or human or social costs on a state to make it change its policy. In this case, in the case of the Etzel or the Irgun, which is a group within the Zionist movement fighting against the British, they wanted to establish the state of Israel. They felt like the British were occupiers there, and so this group actually used violence and terrorism not only against the local Arab community, but also against the British, as an idea of, hey, we can keep driving up the cost of the British remaining in this territory. Eventually, that will outweigh the benefits of them staying here. They'll leave and we'll win. This is a picture of Menachem Begin, who was actually the leader of the Irgun at the time. One of the major attacks they had was the bombing of the King David Hotel, which is pictured here. Killed both some British military officials as well as large numbers of civilians, including some Jewish civilians. Okay, or we've got spoiling. In this case, you're trying to have and use fear to drive a wedge between parties who are seeking peace. So if we look at the Good Friday agreements, the potential agreement to end much of the violence and the troubles in Northern Ireland between the British and the Irish, between the Catholics and the Protestants, between members of Sinn Féin and people on the Protestant side like the UDA and other political organizations, there were people who didn't want that to happen. There were people who felt like, no, we need to keep fighting until we have a united Ireland, or no, we need to keep fighting and never give in on giving the Catholics more rights within Northern Ireland. And so you had a bombing like this. The real IRA, a splinter from the provisional IRA, launches a bombing in Oman in 1998 to try to spoil the peace, to prevent it from being consummated. And again, the way you do that is this violence drives fear between these individuals. Fear that Jerry Adams and the IRA and Sinn Féin can't actually control this type of violence. Fear with Tony Blair and the British that he's going to look bad domestically if he signs a deal while people are being killed at the same time. Fear is a key part of spoiling. Let's think about outbidding. During the Second Intifada, when you have Palestinian organizations who feel like Israel is occupying their territory and they're trying to establish the state of Palestine. Yes, certainly there was violence that was used to try to drive the Israelis out. But a lot of the use of suicide bombings during this period was also organizations competing with one another. One group is launching a number of attacks, so another group feels like, look, I'm going to lose some popular support here if I don't look like I'm standing up for the cause and fighting against the common enemy, so I'm going to have to launch more attacks in response. Even though they share a common enemy, they also internally compete for power and try to outbid one another in the use of violence. The way fear works here is a group is actually fearful it's going to lose its political position, so therefore it's employing violence to try to maintain or strengthen it. What about intimidation? Sometimes people use terrorism against their quote-unquote own community. The GIA in Algeria in the early 1990s brutally murdered and killed thousands of civilians. Not necessarily because they were fighting for the other side, but because they were worried as a group that these individuals might drop dimes on them or give intelligence information about their whereabouts to the government, or simply because they wanted to let people know that they were a group that was not to be messed with. In this case, they're using fear directly. These are individuals holding up pictures of their husbands or sons or fathers who had been killed by the GIA in Algeria. The idea, again, being, let's try to silence these people and make them a passive or fearful population to allow us to operate and potentially try to bring down the government. Finally, we've got provocation. And again, if we look at the two largest terrorist attacks in American history, one could argue that they both had the strategy of provocation as part of the thinking of the terrorists. Timothy McVeigh, again, the individual who launched the Oklahoma City bombings, his idea was the U.S. government's incredibly oppressive. But what he needs to do is launch an attack to get them to crack down and overreact even more to show the rest of America just how oppressive the U.S. government is, and therefore inspire potential revolt to overthrow the government. Ultimately unsuccessful, but nonetheless this was part of his thinking. Osama bin Laden, again, had many thoughts behind why to launch the 9/11 attacks. But one of them was potentially to provoke the U.S. to overreact, invade Afghanistan or other parts of the Middle East, and then bleed them economically or in terms of public support and eventually get them to withdraw from the Middle East. Again, not necessarily a successful strategy to this point, but nonetheless part of the thinking. In both cases, provocation plays again on fear. The fear of a targeted and hit population that needs to strike back to show how strong it is. And furthermore, fear of politicians that if they don't do enough, people like you and me are going to vote or push them out of office. Fear, again, motivating the strategy of the people who are using this type of violence. Other negative or detrimental aspects of fear. Maybe you guys have seen either of these pictures before. In the aftermath of the Boston Marathon attacks, this was the cover of the New York Post here on the left. This is fear because here you have a magazine that's trying to identify the people who launched the attacks, but again, potentially using their fear about people's ethnic background or profiling to be able to identify them. As we learned not too long after, these were certainly not the individuals who launched the attacks. And we saw similar things on Reddit and elsewhere where people were trying to identify who launched the bombings, but again, potentially doing significant damage to those individuals and their reputation simply because we're afraid and we need to identify as quickly as we can who the ones are who committed the bombings. This is a picture of Heba Abolaban. She's a Palestinian doctor who's here in the United States. She had done her observation at Charles MGH and now I believe is getting her master's in public health at Northeastern. And a couple of days after the attack, she was walking with her child and one of her friends when some guy came up to her and hit her and basically cursed her out and said, you know, you're a dirty Muslim, you guys are responsible for these attacks, etc., etc. Again, a terrible hate crime driven by fear. Someone's fear of something that they don't really understand very well, but again, leading to incredibly detrimental attacks, both in terms of not being a morally upstanding way of acting, not in line with American values, but even if you're incredibly, racist or ethnic bigot, not strategically intelligent either. As we're going to talk about a little bit later, one of the key aspects of preventing terrorist attacks is having strong community bonds. Actions like this are the exact opposite of that idea. Final thing on fear. One of the other big dangers is what happens as a result of sustained terrorist attacks. This is a map of Baghdad, the western suburbs of Baghdad, from 2003 to 2009. The colors represent ethnic groups. If we see red, that's a predominantly Sunni neighborhood, green a predominantly Shia neighborhood, and orange a mixed neighborhood. If we look back in 2003, right at the dawn of U.S. war in Iraq and around Baghdad, we have large numbers of mixed neighborhoods here in orange. And we also have green and red, predominantly Sunni and Shia neighborhoods pretty interspersed. Over time, as we see the violence ramping up, we see ethnic sorting. To the point now in Baghdad, you basically have Shia communities, Sunni communities, and fewer mixed neighborhoods. This is not only a potential tragedy in the sense of people having to identify, make friends, intermarry along ethnic lines, but also it polarizes the community in a way that makes it much more vulnerable to the appeals of groups who would drive these types of things, like Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS in Syria, or previously Al-Qaeda in Iraq. All right, now let's move aside from fear for a moment. Where is there hope here? What's ironic is I'm going to start talking to you about hope in terms of the effectiveness of terrorism, which is not normally where we would think we would find hope, right? I mean, this is the impact of this stuff. We would think this would be the most fearful, the least hopeful part. But actually, it is hopeful. First, we want to make sure we understand effectiveness across a couple levels of analysis. Tactical effectiveness is actually whether you carry out a given attack. You kill some people, you're able to successfully detonate a bomb, etc. But there's other types of effectiveness. Organizationally, do you actually drive up popular support for you or your organization? Do you get more recruits? Do you get more funding? Do you become more politically powerful? And then finally, strategic effectiveness, where many of us might think about it. Do you actually get political concessions? Does the government give in to you in terms of changing discriminatory laws or ending political occupation? Do these things actually happen? Let's go through each one by one. If we talk about actual tactical effectiveness inside the United States, the number of people killed, these are casualties from 1991 to 2000 in the United States by terrorist attacks, 217. Obviously, 2001, this would be pretty high, close to 3,000 because of the 9/11 attacks. But then 2002 to 2010, 25 people in the United States were killed by terrorism attacks. 25. Every life is precious. Each of those attacks is a tragedy. But in terms of the actual number of people even killed by attacks inside the United States, this is quite a small figure for an 8-year period, thankfully. What about looking at this stuff over time? We assume, oh, we're in the age of terrorism, right? More and more terrorism all the time. This is terrorism in the United States from 1970 up until 2011. The entire span of terrorist attacks you can find in the Global Terrorism Database, which is a database I recommend checking out if you're interested in looking at stats on terrorism based on country, based on group, etc. You can just go right on there. All I did is just say, okay, attacks in the U.S. From 70 to 2011. Number of attacks. High number around 1970, a lot dealing with anti-Vietnam War protests from various groups on the left, on the right, and the center. Also going down significantly to the point that we're averaging, maybe 10 or fewer attacks each year, and then we look at actual fatal attacks. Okay? Total number of fatal attacks is almost nil each year in the United States. Again, doesn't seem to accord with what we hear about in the media all the time, but this is the case inside the U.S. in terms of fatalities. If we look globally, certainly the numbers are higher, but it's not millions of people dead a year. It's few thousand people dead a year. Again, tragedy, but not nearly on the level of other types of violence. Look more up close, 2001 to 2011. How many people are being killed? Again, going down generally in terms of the number of attacks, number of fatal attacks, many years 0. The highest year is some, 5 fatal attacks inside the United States. Let's compare this to some other things that might kill you. Car accidents, right? Pretty much everyone in this room has probably driven a car. 35,000 people killed each year in a car accident. Now, to be clear, you drive every day, right? This is a controllable thing. It's not something you're as afraid about. But compare 35,000 deaths a year to, 10, 20, 30 deaths a year for terrorism. It's not even in the same ballpark. Lightning, something that generally I think we would assume is some type of, exogenous random thing, unless we still think, Zeus is hurling thunderbolts down, or, God is somehow striking people who are doing really bad things, which, maybe we think. Nonetheless, kills 55 people per year in the United States. 55 million would be like, 2012, that crazy apocalyptic movie. Most years more than terrorism, yet again. And yet again, are we going around being like, let's spend hundreds of billions of dollars in the Department of Homeland Lightning Security to kind of have more lightning rods and whatever else? No, for the most part, we're not. Lone wolf attacks. Again, breathe a sigh of relief here. Attacks by organizations are generally far more deadly than lone wolf attacks. Certainly, lone wolves might be harder to identify and stop beforehand, but guess what else? When you're a lone wolf, you don't have training and experience on the battlefield for the most part. You don't necessarily know how to build a bomb or carry out an attack. And so much of the time, it's these individuals like the Times Square bomber who built a bomb and then it didn't actually go off, thank goodness, because it could have killed many, many people in Times Square. Or it's individuals who are caught in some FBI sting thinking they're about to detonate a bomb, and then they realize they never even knew what they were doing in the first place. So again, potential hope there. What about organizations? Some of my research looks at various national movements. Some of the groups in these movements use nonviolent methods. Some use violent methods. Some of the ones that use violent methods attack civilians and use terrorist attacks. Whether you look in the Zionist movement before the founding of the State of Israel, you look in the Irish national movement in Northern Ireland and beforehand, you look in the Palestinian national movement, you do actually see groups going up and down at various points when they're using violence. Sometimes violence does work in this regard to help an organization get recruits or get some popular support. But at the end of the day, it can also backfire. If you kill civilians, particularly civilians valued by a movement, that can lead to a steep drop-off in your popular support. It's also something that rarely propels a group from nothing to the top. That group I talked to you about before, the Irgun, they used terrorist attacks, again, against the British and against Arab civilians. They never became the strongest group in the Zionist movement. The Haganah, the labor Zionists, became the top group. They were in charge of Israel for 30 years after the founding of the state. Within Ireland, somewhat similarly, we have the SDLP, a nonviolent group who's in charge of the movement or leading the movement for many, many years throughout its struggle, despite not actually using violence. What about strategic effectiveness? Again, we can certainly find certain examples where groups are getting concessions. But overall, even though there's some debate on this, and I've weighed in on this in my own research, the majority of campaigns get no significant political concessions. In terms of actually having a state withdraw or grant a new state in response to terrorist attacks or a terrorist campaign, the majority of the time it does not lead to major significant concessions. Furthermore, when there are concessions, it's tough to kind of pull apart to what extent it was because of a terrorist attack versus other things that the movement is actually doing. A lot of the times, the groups within these movements that are launching attacks are fringe in terms of the size of the group, in terms of the number of things they're doing versus the protests, the elections, the other things that are happening that are working towards the broader cause. Finally, again, in terms of lone wolves, they don't have two key things that most armed groups that are successful actually have. They don't have organizational cohesion, and they don't have extensive strength to be able to continue a sustained campaign against the state. States usually don't tuck tail and run after a single attack. You have to wear them down often over time. Lone wolves have a harder time doing that. Okay, let's think about the actual perspective of the groups who are launching some of this stuff. Now, one could actually read Inspire. I kind of recommend you don't, because then you'll be on government blacklists like I am in terms of reading this stuff. But this is Al-Qaeda's English language magazine. In the aftermath of the Boston Marathon attacks, they came out with an article praising the bombers. And one of the things they said was as follows, quote, "The Zarnaev Mujahideen were very clever by striking on the marathon day in consideration that the event attracted 27,000 registered participants, in addition to approximately 500,000 spectators and about 1,000 media personnel from more than 100 outlets." And just in case you don't think they're thinking about you, Boston University and Boston College are located near the blasts. So again, they think that this was a successful attack, and it was a good idea because everyone's watching, because it's near places where people care about, the media's paying attention to it, et cetera, et cetera. Well, guess what? I think this was maybe the stupidest terrorist attack I've ever seen, for a number of reasons. If you're thinking about a place to attack or a group of people to attack, I would not be picking marathon runners. And I would not be picking the Boston Marathon, the oldest continuously run marathon in the United States. These are people who, as I've learned personally, unfortunately or fortunately, train for many, many months, go through injuries, and nonetheless still decide they want to run 26 miles just for the heck of it. Not for money, not for fame, not for whatever else, to raise money, thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars for charities. And then you have the people who go and attend the marathon. I'm sure everyone in this room has done so, maybe watching up here at Heartbreak Hill in Boston College. What do you do there? You cheer everybody who goes by. People you've never met before in your entire life. Doesn't matter what the color of their skin is or what their religion is. You cheer them on. You support them. When does the Boston Marathon happen? Every year. These guys attack something that basically is going to commemorate the victims of the attack and respond to it every year, even if people didn't want to. It's going to be happening again and again. It gets to the point that if you were to say to me, what should a community do in response to a terrorist attack, I might say, start a commemorative marathon after that attack. And yet, these guys think this was the way to go. This was the target to actually hit. Now, the real answer is the people who launched this attack were not some terrorist mastermind who thought through this incredibly deeply about the best thing to do. In fact, reports later came out that they were going to attack on July 4th, and then they had the bombs ready earlier, and this was kind of a target of convenience. Well, guess what? At the end of the day, I think it was quite a terrible target to attack tactically, and in terms of actual lone wolf, these guys are actually a bit of an anomaly, thankfully. The vast majority of lone wolves who, again, try to launch an attack don't even explode the bombs in the first place. They don't even kill people, thankfully, let alone get to this other stuff. There weren't any other groups that claimed this attack that was verified, and there wasn't a massive outpouring of support for these individuals. Furthermore, I haven't seen anything even close to a consideration from the government in Boston, Massachusetts, or in the United States of making any concessions to these guys, let alone if they even offered or suggested any. Furthermore, a lot of the time what can happen with things like Inspire elsewhere is they can confuse quote-unquote tactical victories and strategic defeats. And they keep thinking, oh, we launched another attack, our voice is still out there, we're winning. Whereas they're not necessarily paying attention to these other things. Are you politically becoming any stronger? Are you actually changing or getting any concessions on the ground? That can be one of the most detrimental ways to actually think about your campaign, but thankfully, again, it seems that's the way that some of these groups are actually thinking. Okay. So we've talked about fear, we've talked about hope. How exactly does resilience play into all of this? In terms of what community resilience is, one way to define it is the sustained ability of a community to respond to, withstand, and recover from adverse situations. I would argue that this is the single key factor that's important for what we can do as individuals and as a community to both deter attacks and prevent their negative impacts in the aftermath. If we think about what community resilience actually means and ways to break it down, I think there are three key factors: cohesion, knowledge, and emotion. Let me talk you through a little bit about each of them. First, in terms of cohesion, there's a term that we often use sometimes in sociology or political science called civil society. It's basically the idea of, does your community have social bonds that extend kind of beyond the government? Do you have volunteer organizations and social clubs and faith groups and these types of things that allow you to interact and become close with people in your community in ways that aren't necessarily just instrumental, not just for your own economic interest or political interest? Communities that have this stuff have a whole range of benefits, from better governance to happier, more economically prosperous lives to, I would argue, those that are actually having built-in support networks for when tragedy actually strikes. So this is very, very important, actually having cohesion as a community. In addition to this, I would say it's not just cohesion, it's also knowledge. What do I mean by knowledge? Knowledge of what terrorism actually is, the history and precedents of both the attacks themselves, as well as precedents for how communities and states respond. What are the international or national laws about human rights, about how terrorist suspects are treated, or how victims are dealt with, or how we can potentially impinge on civil liberties? Knowing this stuff is very, very important for being a resilient community that's not just led along the primrose path by the government to doing X, Y, or Z in response to an attack. In terms of my own research, again, I talked to you earlier about how many people were fearful about terrorism before they actually took the class. We've also found statistically significant results that people became much less fearful after having taken a class on terrorism, not just here at Boston College, but at over 15 universities around the country. So knowledge in this case is power. It's power to be less fearful about something that otherwise is going to make you do potentially negative things, or also live your life in a way that's not going to be nearly as positive. It's also going to lead you to be more confident about engaging with your opinions. We also ask people, how confident are you about knowing about terrorism, about engaging with this stuff? People who, again, have knowledge about this, much more confident, potentially being able to engage with government officials, other people in their community. Finally, knowledge is about having clear communication and transparency with the government. This is a big issue, particularly in the United States, where we care about knowing and listening to, the police communications when they're going through the lockdown in Boston. Or we're dealing with the fact that, again, if you go into YouTube today and you type in Boston Marathon, I mean, it saddens me, but pretty much the whole first page is just conspiracy theories about how the attacks were fake, or, it was planned by the government or whatever else. Having knowledge allows you to, debunk not only those kind of easily debunked conspiracy theories, but also people who would otherwise try to tell you what the lessons are of these types of attacks. Final point in terms of emotions. I hear this all the time, and academics think about this all the time. We're always trying to study rational people. And rational usually means, let's add up the costs and benefits and let's get emotions out of it. Let's get happiness or hatred or anger or passion to the side, and let's just think rationally as human beings. One of the problems with that is that I actually think emotion in this case can be the biggest source of strength for community resilience, not a source of weakness. As I say here, people talk about revenge being a dish best served cold. I think resilience is a dish best served warm or hot, in the sense of you can use your emotions and channel them to actually have much greater good in terms of building community resilience, building social capital, getting involved in a way that's going to, again, be the both kind of deterrent response and reactive response to an attack. So let's talk about some examples of this within the Boston Marathon. There's a guy named David Diamond who ran his first marathon, first sub-4-hour marathon last year. He's an 18-year veteran of the U.S. Army, has been in the Special Forces, and he had just finished the marathon in 3 hours and 56 minutes and was sitting on the curb kind of exhausted, very excited for the first time he finished in sub 4 hours, and the bombs went off. This was a guy who, again, had training medically as being part of the U.S. Armed Forces. He wasn't someone who kind of could have just sat there being exhausted from having just run a marathon, or someone who could have kind of run away from the explosions. He ran right towards them. He helped to resuscitate people who were hit in the attacks, and then he busted into the marathon sports that was right there, grabbed clothes and other things that could be used as tourniquets, and then distributed them to first responders who were there at the scene of the attacks. This is the type of person who shows me we have a resilient Boston community. If you look at the volunteers for this year, there are 10,000 volunteers for the Boston Marathon in 2014, and they had to turn away 5,000 more people who wanted to volunteer their time for this race. We think about other individuals, and there's hundreds of them, but someone that maybe we all know, Brittany Loring, someone who got her law degree here at BC, suffered brain damage in the attacks. Only months after, they held a 5K in her honor, and she was able to walk through much of it. And to this day, she went and got married, got her law degree, and is now working in Boston as if things never came the way that they did to her. This is resilience personified to me. You might have seen this story come up on the news in the past couple of days. This is Adrienne Hazlitt Davis. She actually lost her leg in the marathon, and she was a dancer. She pledged that she was going to dance again sometime in the next year before the next marathon. And at a TED Talk in Vancouver just a week or two ago, she did. This is a picture of her dancing after she danced a rumba, less than a year after her leg had been blown off. What's incredibly interesting even beyond that is she's dancing with a prosthetic bionic limb that was designed by an MIT researcher, Hugh Herr, himself a double amputee, who's doing cutting-edge research in prosthetic limbs. Again, to me, this is community cohesion at its finest and response to, again, dreadful tragedy. If we think about actual cohesion in terms of what we can do, we might look at this and say, Brittany Loring, David Diamond, Adrienne, these are incredibly impressive people, but, I'm just a student or I'm just a professor, what contribution can I make to community resilience here. And I would say a couple of things. There's a lot of things you can do. First and foremost, there's the Campus School Bandit Run Marathon this Sunday. For those of you who don't know, Runners for Boston, I'm not even sure for how many years, but for many, many years, have gone to raise money and run for the campus school here on the BC campus. And they've run as bandits, which basically means they don't have an official number, but they run within the Boston Marathon. This year, to make it so they could have good security, but they could also get a maximum number of people registered for the marathon, the BAA, the Boston Athletic Association, went to the campus school runners and said, you know, please do not run this year. We're not going to have bandits on the course. We don't want to have to pull you off the course, etc. The people who have been training for months and months and months and months could have just kind of gone home and said, yep, you know, we can't run the marathon, we're not going to do it, or we're going to be depressed about it. But they're not doing that. This Sunday, they're going to run the full course, the full marathon course, by BC, etc. And I'm going to be out there cheering them on, and I hope you guys come as well. What else can you do? You can run and attend events that deal with some of the things that we talked about before, some of the hate crimes that came after the Boston attacks. There was a group here at BC that had a panel on Islamophobia, on Islam and political violence in the days after the marathon attacks. Running and attending these events and trying to strengthen community bonds, particularly with marginalized communities or communities that might be seen through a potential accusatory eye in the aftermath of an attack, that helps the cause. That helps community resilience. A lot of what we can do are things that we already do. If we think about something like the Boston Marathon attacks, thankfully the community that we live in, that's not the norm, that's the anomaly. So when we think about the things we should do, we shouldn't think, oh, things are terrible, let's change everything. We should make sure we recognize all the good things we're already doing. Perhaps the single thing that I am the most impressed about since I joined the Boston College community just a year and a half ago is how many people here give their time and their effort into service. I come from a high school where a lot of people at my public school worked very hard and tried to get great grades, but a lot of the time I felt like if people volunteered and they didn't do it that much, it was trying to kind of be something to build up their resume. Here at BC, I just see the total opposite. Every time I meet with a student who's taking 5 classes and doing a thesis or whatever else, he or she is part of Pulse, or part of For Boston, or part of one of these organizations that builds community resilience and builds social capital in the Boston community. Those of you who are doing that stuff, keep doing it. You're already making a huge contribution to deal with this issue. What about in terms of knowledge? You guys have a great opportunity here being students at Boston College. BC offers outstanding courses in so many areas that are relevant to this stuff. You can take terrorism classes with Professor Gallagher, Professor Borg. You can take classes on U.S. foreign policy, Professor Crawford, Professor Jacobs. You can take classes on Middle East politics, Professor Sajdi or Bailey or Banu Azizi, civil liberties with Professor Kirsch. There's so many opportunities here to improve your knowledge on these things. So if and when you ultimately decide, I'm going to engage in policy debates, or guess what, I'm going to become a policymaker, I'm going to run for office, I'm going to become part of the State Department, you're going to have a solid knowledge base from which to operate. Beyond that, everyone should be thinking about this stuff. We were probably all here, unless we're freshmen, even if we were there, we might have been living in the area, when Boston went on lockdown. And we had house-to-house searches. And we dealt with a lot of things in the aftermath of this. You don't have to agree with everything that happened. In fact, it's okay if you don't. That's the great thing about being in a democracy. But you should think long and hard about what policies were followed. Is this a precedent we want to set? Is this the way we want to act going forward? And hopefully you can then engage at BC or beyond in terms of these debates, because I guarantee you this stuff's not going to go away. We're going to have cameras on the streets maybe. Maybe we're going to have drones. Maybe we're going to have lockdown like this whenever there's attack, or maybe not. This is something we get to decide, and you should be a part of that discussion. Final thing we can do in terms of knowledge, just another example. In my classes, I asked my students to raise their hand if they knew the names of the attackers of the Boston Marathon, and almost everyone raised their hand. And then I asked, how many of you guys know the name of the people who were killed in the Boston Marathon? And almost no one raised their hand. If we're going to change channeling our emotions so it's not just hatred and anger, but it's positive emotions and remembering and commemorating the people who are hurt, we need to learn about these people. This is Martin Richard and Crystal Campbell. They were both killed in the initial bombings on the day of the marathon. This is Lu Lingzi, a foreign student who was here studying in the United States, also killed in the marathon, and Sean Collier, the MIT police officer who I'd seen around campus actually a couple times when I was back at MIT, who was killed a couple days after the marathon. If you want to see a list, and again I'll make this PowerPoint slide public, you can see a list of the other, as Professor Owens mentioned, over 260 victims who were wounded in these attacks. Learn these people, learn who they are. Beyond that, if we're thinking about emotions, again, don't just think about them as negative things or things that we need to get rid of. As I say to myself, we're often told to put our emotions aside, to think clearly and rationally and not let passions get in the way. I believe, and there's actually good research to support this, that you and I should use emotion to help us take that extra step that the calm, rational you or I may not have done. To sign up to volunteer or run for the campus school, or to go cheer those people on Sunday. To attend the panel on political violence, to reach out to someone from a different background, to take that class on a topic you know nothing about, to write a letter to those you care about telling them how much they mean to you. I don't have a better personal test of this than on the day of the marathon. As I sat with my wife watching the runners go by around 1 p.m., she literally asked me, "Would you ever want to run the Boston Marathon?" My response, "Not in a million years. I respect those who do, but running 26.2 miles is just not for me." 3 hours later, in the midst of intense anger, sadness, and awe, as a result of the attacks, the victims, and the courageous response of the first responders, I pledged to run the Boston Marathon for the first time and tried to inspire others to do the same. That was my emotions taking me somewhere that my rational self had not wanted to go. But despite a long and challenging road of training, I've never regretted it for 1 second. I ended my letter to the Heights by saying that I'm going to run the 2014 Boston Marathon, and I am. And I asked who's with me. Now that we have some understanding of the causes, dynamics, and effects of terrorism and the importance of community resilience, and we look at all of these amazing people in the BC community and beyond making a difference, I ask, who's with them? Hopefully your presence here tonight means you are. And if so, I think the future of our city and our world is very bright. Thank you.
For some questions, and I'm going to let Professor Krause just make the call from the floor here.
Sounds great. Please. Yes. That's a great question. So I think absolutely you have to give some credit to the intelligence community and people who are both spending massive amounts of human and economic resources trying to sniff out potential attacks, trying to prevent this stuff from happening. I think it's hard because this is classified information. Every once in a while the CIA or someone will leak, oh, here are the number of attacks we prevented, but it's tough to actually kind of assess that stuff in an objective fashion. But I think without a doubt they played a role in stopping some of these attacks. However, though, I'll also say, when we look before 9/11 or before the Oklahoma City bombings, it's not like we were being killed thousands and thousands of people all the time. The U.S. enjoys a number of inherent advantages, and advantages that we've also gotten as a result of who we are as a community, I think. One is we nicely have these two moats to either side of us, the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, which are not important just for preventing potential international terrorist attacks, but also international conflict in general. It's one of the biggest advantages we've had geographically as a nation. But also I do think, look, if you look at things like democracy and human rights and values that the U.S. supports, certainly domestically and then to varying degrees internationally, and you look at Pew or other world public opinion polls, you see support for this stuff across the board. It's one of the reasons that when politicians say things like, the U.S. is getting attacked because of its values or things along these lines, I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case. I think a lot of the times people abroad share a lot of these values about democracy being a great form of government, to some extent about liberal values about democracy. I think a lot of the time when there's anger at the U.S., it has more to do with U.S. foreign policy or other issues. Again, doesn't mean because there's anger we should necessarily change those policies. But I think to some extent that's where a lot of the anger comes from. But I do think ultimately U.S. and the things they've done post 9/11, they certainly spent a lot of money on it and put a lot of effort into it, but I think it definitely has had an impact in driving down the number of attacks and number of fatalities. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. From now on, I will repeat the questions so we can know for people there at home. But please try to speak up too. Yes. Okay, so great. So two questions. One, kind of, what about the Israeli example or analogy? Is that a type of policy the U.S. should think about following? And what do I think about, the lockdown and kind of Boston's response to these attacks? So first, in terms of the Israelis, again, I teach classes on international relations in the Middle East. I teach multiple weeks on the Arab-Israeli conflict. I can't, in this short answer I'm going to give you, walk through all my feelings on that or the background history of that. If you want to talk about that, come see me afterwards. But in terms of that specific example, I would say that the IDF, it was a colonel or whoever else you talked to, I think he has some things right, but I think there's some things wrong there. I do think that Israeli policies in the Second Intifada helped to lessen the number of attacks, at least in the short term, against Israel. But I also think there were some organizational decisions on the side of the Palestinians that they didn't think violence was being effective. Also, I'll say, though, just as I said before for organizations, they can sometimes confuse tactical victories with strategic ones. I think that's one of the problems the Israelis currently face. People are often focused on how many Israelis are dying in Palestinian attacks, or again, vice versa, Palestinians killed by Israeli attacks. But one of the problems the Israelis have is, yeah, they're very aggressive. Yeah, they're controlling large portions of this territory, but what are they going to do now? Are they going to annex this territory? Are they going to pull back? They have a very difficult situation where they've tamped down the number of attacks, but the amount of, how they're seen by Palestinians in terms of popular opinion, world opinion, etc., I think has been very detrimental because of some of those aggressive tactics. So one of the main issues is, do you try to sacrifice other potential organizational political gains to drive down the number of attacks, or is there some level of attacks that are potentially acceptable, or is there some broader political process that you can hopefully push forward to kind of get at all of those things? In terms of the the Boston response in terms of the lockdown, I do think it was effective in the following sense. Some people correctly note, guess what? They captured Jahar right after they stopped the lockdown. So maybe the lockdown was ineffective. But I do think it ultimately helped kind of cordon and keep him in a confined area where eventually he was found. I do think it was something that was effective, and I think the community response afterwards, there were definitely some people who were saying, oh, this had economic costs, oh, this is a potential precedent for state power, which is dangerous. But overall, I saw many BC students and elsewhere out there cheering the police and being very happy. They felt safer. They felt like this had been effective. I would get very concerned if something like this happens on a yearly basis, or even a multi-yearly basis. Then it would be something where I'm not sure if that's the best type of response if the costs outweigh the benefits. Thankfully, to this point, as I said, it's pretty much an anomaly. It's not something we've had before. Hopefully something we won't have again. If we do again and again, I think we should revisit that question. But for now, I do think it was an effective response in the aftermath of this unprecedented attack. Yes?
You've done a lot of research on the Middle East.
Yes.
And there's such a debate left and right on the proper U.S. response to Syria, Libya, Yemen.
Yeah.
What is your view of that? That's making it too political?
So you have to narrow it down for me a bit. The question was, what is my view of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East?
Right, and how it affects terrorism.
Oh, great question. Okay. So here's the deal. If we were to go look at the global terrorism database and the number of attacks, we would see two countries in particular having the vast majority of attacks in the 2000s. What countries do we think those would be? Iraq and Afghanistan, okay? So that happens to be places where the United States is there with large numbers of armed forces, et cetera, et cetera. Now, does that mean that the U.S. caused those terrorist attacks and doing those invasions was a bad idea? I don't think that's necessarily true. In fact, I think Afghanistan is a war I definitely supported and still think was a good idea initially the way that we did it. In terms of it inspiring terrorist attacks, though, I do think that when you have a military force that some people see as being foreign and potentially occupying a given piece of territory, running the government, et cetera, not speaking the language or not knowing the customs, it's going to lead to some inherent tension there, particularly when you can't necessarily intervene in a quote-unquote impartial way. You're naturally going to be backing one side versus the other. And we did that in Afghanistan. We did that in Iraq. We backed the Northern Alliance against the Taliban. We backed, Maliki or some other previous Iraqi leaders against, Saddam and his people. So in that sense, the U.S. being involved in some of these countries is inherently going to drive up some of this type of violence. The broader and the more million-dollar question is, what happens in the aftermath? Does this lead to more hatred or anger or violence against the U.S. now or 5 or 10 years from now? Do you create groups like Al-Qaeda or like ISIS now in Syria who potentially are going to take the training and the experience they have in these conflicts and then decide where's the next fight? Now we're going to go at the far enemy, the United States, or potentially our allies in the region, the Saudis or whoever else. I think that in the short term, tactically, the answer is aggressive U.S. intervention does drive up these attacks. I think that that's inescapable. The question, though, is that shouldn't be the only determination. There's obviously other benefits. The reasons that the U.S. intervenes in a country a lot of the time is try to provide stability, potentially then this is a very mixed record, but potentially try to promote democracy in some fashion. Again, we saw how hard that is often to do, but sometimes the U.S. has done it. If you do those types of things, there is research that can show that can lead to eventually people in the country becoming more prosperous, more stable, potentially more attacks emanating from it. But that is a kind of long-term process that often doesn't go the way that you want to. So the question is, do you want to pay the short-term tactical cost of potentially more attacks then, try to get the longer-term cost of helping nudge these societies in a way that's going to become potentially more stable, democratic, prosperous, etc.? Some people think that's a good idea, others don't. I think that the key distinction is, do you think U.S. intervention ultimately is a force for good or not so good in terms of making these countries more stable, democratic, etc.? We look at Germany, Japan, some of these ones that are often trotted out as positive interventions. We see some good potential outcomes of that. These are two of our strongest allies today. You look at U.S. attempts to state build in Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't know if they're the best examples of things that have gone well in any way. So, I think it depends on what the case is. It's not something that can say an overall yes or no. It depends on the specifics. But I think that those are the type of considerations you want to think about. Yes? Oh, sorry. Okay, well, here, and then we'll go to Eric.
What would you prescribe to Ukraine-Russian part?
Okay. So now we're going a bit outside my geographic expertise, but I will say, I do study international relations, international security. So do you mean what I prescribe in terms of for the people of Ukraine or for U.S. foreign policy, or what issue? Okay. Yeah, so I think that what's going on in the Ukraine right now is to some extent a story we've seen before, where you have a disputed territory. Obviously, the Crimea was an area that was given by Khrushchev from Russia to the Ukraine when it was under the Soviet Union. The Russians see it as a part of their country that has majority ethnic Russians. The Ukrainians see it as historically part of their country, certainly part of their country officially for many decades now. And then you also have ethnically Russian populations, the eastern part of Ukraine, that are potentially threatening to join Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, what do I prescribe should be done there? What might happen there? I think a couple of things. In terms of just the Ukrainian people themselves, as I say here with national movements, they're more or less successful depending on how cohesive they are, if they have a hegemon, if they kind of have strong leadership. One of the problems I see for the current Ukrainian government, kind of the Western Ukrainian government, the one in Kiev, is that they agreed very strongly. They didn't necessarily want the previous kind of pro-Russian president in there. But I haven't necessarily seen kind of a clear consensus about what they do want or how they are going to go about carrying this stuff out, either in terms of ordering their military to stay in the Crimea or not, or how they're going to deal with protests, et cetera, et cetera. So if they want to do better and hold on to the rest of their country, I think they need to unite somehow behind some type of strong consensus and a strong leader. In terms of U.S. foreign policy, it's a dicey issue. As people know who are in my international studies classes, we talk about precedent for this stuff. Guess what? You can find tons of examples where the U.S. supported some part of a sovereign state voting to have independence and then pulling off, and the U.S. supports it as a new state, and the Russians protesting. And now you can find the exact opposite scenario, where the Crimea had a referendum, overwhelmingly went for Russia. Now, to be clear, Russian troops are stationed there. There could be some intimidation there, but even without that being the case, I would bet they probably still would have voted to join Russia. And yet now the Russians are saying, this is something that we support independence, we support self-determination, and the U.S. and the EU and other countries are saying, no, you can't do that. So in terms of legal precedent or international norms, I think that countries play that stuff one way or the other based on their self-interest. Whether it's in the U.S. interest to get involved, I don't think it's in U.S. interest to send troops there. I do think it's in U.S. interest to back its NATO allies, to back the EU. Now, to be clear, Ukraine's not part of NATO, but one of the things that was talked about is that it's on track to potentially become part of NATO. I actually think in many ways that's the source of this whole issue, is that the U.S., again, somewhat naively, I think, has kind of felt, what, we're just going to keep building NATO again and again into Eastern Europe, right against Russia's border, through the whole old Warsaw Pact, and there's not going to be any problem. The Russians obviously take exception to that. Now, if the U.S. wants to do that and pay the cost of it, that's fine. But I think we've done this in a somewhat naive way of thinking that the Russians aren't going to strike back, and now we're seeing the result of that, and we need to deal with it. So I think just as the Ukrainian people and their leadership needs to make a decision here, the U.S. also has to decide. Are we going to keep putting NATO right abutting Russia's borders, or are we going to kind of say, look, Ukraine's going to be neutral, we want it to be independent, we don't want the Russians running it, but we're also not trying to make it anti-Russian and hold sway there. That, to me, seems like the best future for the Ukrainian people, but given how things have gone, I'm not sure if we can get there. Yes? Oh, sorry. Okay, yes, Brooke.
Thank you, Professor Krause. I actually
Yeah.
How does that fit into this paradigm of studying terrorism? Because it's different in this case, but at the same time, I think there's a lot that can be learned.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, Brooke's question in short was the Anders Breivik case, where you had this guy who went to an island where your kind of young community political activists were, and killed large numbers of them. What was it, in the 70s or 80s even? In terms of number of people who were killed. Now he's been on trial in Norway. I'm not sure if his exact, he's probably going to be jailed, but not even necessarily for life. Like the laws in the books they had potentially could have gotten out. I'm not sure if they've adjusted them. I haven't followed the case close enough, but the question is, what are the potential lessons from this attack? How do people who study terrorism, the social science community, respond to this? When you have kind of a true kind of lone wolf like this guy, it's pretty clear he wasn't part of any broader organization that's going to launch some broader campaign in Norway. I think that even more so, community resilience becomes a key part of it. Because if you're dealing with an Al-Qaeda, or you're dealing with the IRA, or FARC in Colombia, or whatever else, you both have to be resilient as a community to withstand attacks and have strong social bonds amongst individuals, but you also have to have the government being involved to deter attacks, to potentially go and find these people, to use intelligence services, etc. In the case of Norway, again, to the extent that there aren't any other people out there who are inspired by him or going to do the same thing, I don't think the intelligence and the government role is as important. I think it is much more on the individuals. And so I think that to the extent that that's what they're saying they're going to do, that's the exact right answer. It's just a small thing, but man, I don't know if you saw the schematic for the memorial they're going to have for that attack, but it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. They basically are chopping out a whole portion of the island. So the island just has these two straight cleaves through it with water going through, the idea being that the people's lives who are there are interrupted, and it's going to be kind of a memorial for them on that island. And again, that's not everything, but to me it seems like a community who's both going to do the right thing of clearly memorializing the victims, trying to become stronger as a community to prevent this type of stuff, but then also not radically changing their way of lives and the values that they have in response to what, to this point, thankfully has been a single anomalous attack. Yes? Yeah.
It's criticized as like a holiday island, even though it has the lowest recidivism rate in Europe.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in what you think, as far as I understand it, Jafar Sanayed is still going to be on trial for his life.
Correct. Yeah, they said they're going to pursue the death penalty.
So I'm interested what you think in the light of this, training of post in the case of Syria, what you think, and also considering how the international community might view the U.S. if they do execute him, what you think the response is in terms of sanctions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I'm not an expert on the Norwegian justice system, but I do remember in the aftermath of this, some people saying like maybe he's only going to be in prison for 15 years or whatever else, even though he killed almost 100 people. Certainly very different than the U.S. justice system. Yeah, I think a couple of things. I have a colleague who's up the road at Belfer at Harvard, who has done some research on these rehabilitation programs. Some of the most famous ones, the Saudis have one, where they say, oh, we have like a 90% success rate. We take former jihadis who had launched violence or been captured on the battlefields of Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan. We put them through these rehabilitation centers, and then they come out and they're peaceful now. The problem is it's really, really tough to analyze the effectiveness of these programs. Because if we think about incentives, certainly the government has the incentive to say this is how well things are going. Right. Excuse me. And they're not going to necessarily give someone exposure to, here are all the people, here are the ones who have been let out, let's look at their attacks thereafter. A lot of this stuff is very clandestine and kept hush-hush. My colleague who's worked on this stuff knows better than anyone else. She's done interviews with people, etc., but even she's a bit skeptical of how effective this can be, and again, it totally depends on the individual. So I'm someone who believes in rehabilitation for people in certain circumstances, but the question is, depending on the individual, is that something that's going to be a positive that can turn their lives around, or is it something that's going to be perceived as, light punishment for someone, and so therefore more people might be inspired to launch these attacks, become an international celebrity, get out in 5 years, etc. In terms of the broader question about, the death penalty, certainly the U.S. still uses it. Many countries around the world do not. It's one of the things that, the opposite of what I said before. If you ask people about, U.S. culture or music or democracy, you generally get high ratings internationally. If you ask about policy regarding prison systems or the death penalty, those often go down quite a bit. I will say this. I think that the Boston Marathon case and, Jahar's guilt and potential punishment is not something that I would first think about in terms of international public opinion and response. It's something I would think about handling one way or the other, but it wouldn't be kind of the main reason that I would or would not pursue the death penalty. I would make that distinction based on kind of my own and the community values, both in Boston, in Massachusetts, in the United States, and I would kind of hash it out that way, and then to the extent that it led to positive support, maybe if it was not the death penalty, or negative backlash if it was, I would kind of deal with that. But ultimately, even though I'm an IR person and I pay a lot of attention to international public opinion, I wouldn't think it should drive it here. Yes?
How would you compare and contrast these terrorist attacks that have been so prominent recently in our country to other kind of like mass shooting, not necessarily terrorist?
Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. That's something we do talk about in my terrorism class, because again, if you just kind of take away maybe like the political objective, everything else about the definition, many of the causes are kind of like ping, 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 they all line up. And certainly an argument has been made, it is tragic that hundreds of people were injured in this and 4 people were killed here, right? But some commentators will say, but thousands of people die in shootings every year in the U.S., and we don't necessarily have the same symposia about that or about a mass shooting that we do about a terrorist attack. And I've laid out some of the reasons that might be, right? We're more fearful of terrorism, it's more uncontrollable, it's more unknowable, we feel like we can identify with them, maybe more than some people who were killed in a homicide, I don't know. But how does it match up? I think some of the causes are the same. Some of the things in terms of social ostracism or potentially revenge or humiliation, to me those tick off a lot of the things when you see these mass shooters. There seem to be a lot of similarities there. I think where you get some of the differences is when you get to kind of the organizational strategic level, you don't necessarily see mass shootings as a result of groups competing for notoriety. You don't necessarily see them as a result of kind of occupation or war in the same fashion. So I think where you see similarities are at that individual level, why someone might get involved with this stuff. And that's why in the field of political science and criminology and sociology, you see people who study that, and they don't necessarily do it as terrorism, non-terrorism. It's kind of like someone who gets involved in violence or not, and they find a lot of similarities there. Yes?
Thank you very much for taking that. Very insightful. My question has to do with the recent string of attacks in China.
Yes.
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 Quite a few months ago. And I was wondering how, if these imposing resilience fit into like the state control government such as China, and how the people might react differently depending on time. The government shut down a lot of the bloggers and a lot of the
Yep. Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I'll say I'm not a China expert by any means. I did have a student, actually. I had a graduate, a PhD student in my terrorism and political violence class who wrote his research paper on the Uyghurs and their struggle in China and some of the violence that's come out of it. So I learned a little bit about that through his research as well as just my own. But I'll say a couple of things. In the case of China or other countries who kind of have, more strongly state-controlled media or government with this type of stuff, I feel like in many ways they don't rely on their people. They don't rely on the community to be resilient in the same fashion. They feel like we want to kind of tamp down on this. Don't let people hear about it because it might make the government look weak or like it's not protecting you, or we're going to kind of take care of it. We don't want to let people feel like they can get notoriety from this or they can kind of live through this, so we're going to kind of stamp down very harshly. So I think in that sense, a government like China, again, not being an expert on it, but to the extent I see how it responds to this stuff, it doesn't necessarily allow the same space for the community to kind of fill in with its resilience. And so in that sense, I feel like it might be a bit harder for the people there to do so in the same fashion. But that being said, I think you see increasing amounts of, civil society building in China, people responding to things like the earthquake, et cetera, through the internet in ways that, maybe they weren't doing 20 or 30 years ago. And so even if the government's trying to tamp down on it or not necessarily looking to, build off of it, people are doing it themselves because people in China, have access to the internet the same way everyone else does. They're becoming economically more prosperous. They're demanding more things of their government. So I don't think that the lessons I have presented here would be any different from them. I would just expect it might be a bit more difficult because the government's not a partner potentially in the same way. But I also think that a lot of this stuff happens at the grassroots. And so, as long as the Chinese people can do that, and I think they have the capability to do so, I think they can follow this. And I'd also be surprised, the government might want to crack down on knowledge about the attack, or they want to label it terrorism by the Uyghurs or whoever else. But I'd be surprised if they tried to crack down on individuals who are trying to kind of, reach out across communities or at least try to strengthen, their community bonds in this way. And if so, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot. Oh, okay. One more question? Yes, here.
I heard about the bombings that Mount Everton and Wellesley.
Yep.
I heard about it over Twitter. And so later I went home and I remember listening to you on Channel 5 and CNN. And I want to know what's your feelings on the impact of social media in the 24 hours of this stuff.
Yeah.
I didn't have it with 9/11. There wasn't cell phones
So I don't know if this is the exact percentage, but I would say kind of like 80-20. Like 80% I think it's positive. I think it's great. I don't think we should, be like the Turkish government or other guys like, oh, we're going to ban Twitter because it has things that are unpopular that I think that that's the wrong way to go, and I also think that's pretty much impossible to do. I mean, some countries still do kind of have the kill switch for the internet, but for the most part, this is something that's not going to be able to happen in this day and age. And I think overall, social networks are a net positive for these types of things. Again, it's often oversold in terms of the Arab Spring and some of these protests there, but absolutely, camera phones, Twitter, Facebook, that does help people coordinate protests, coordinate political action, build solidarity across lines with people they've never met before, make people feel like I'm not going to be the only one who's going to show up for this type of thing. It does make a difference. And in the aftermath of a bombing, what's the first thing all of us are going to do? Call our loved ones, try to find out, make sure everyone's okay. The phone lines are often jammed. You can put a notice on Twitter or Facebook. Everyone can kind of see and read that. I think that's incredibly positive. I know myself, I get most of my news from the internet, oftentimes from media organizations, not from social media as much as many of you, and I know my students do. But nonetheless, I know for many people, Twitter is kind of like their first stop to find out what's happening. And you can definitely get much more information much more quickly than something that has to go through an editor at CNN, or even much more difficult, a peer-reviewed journal article that all the professors in the audience know takes 6 months, a year, whatever. The negative side is probably, and I alluded to here, is the standard for what kind of gets published is, of course, much lower. The same thing that allows you to get it out so quickly all of a sudden is not analyzed or looked at in any way. So now rumor can become accepted as fact much more quickly. We don't just get the New York Post cover. We get people on Reddit saying this guy who was from Brown and was disappeared maybe was the bomber. Turned out he had, I think, committed suicide later on, not because of the attack, but previously had been dead. You get this kind of stuff that can damage people's lives and also lead people astray. And then you also can get, again, this phenomenon that I really dislike, which is just basically conspiracy theories about everything. Now, the source of conspiracy theories to me is good. It's people having a skepticism about what they're being told and trying to find the answer themselves. But you want a healthy skepticism. Some of this stuff in the face of, overwhelming fact about the fact that, like, people died 9/11 and the people on the planes aren't hiding somewhere as part of some broad conspiracy, or the bombings and the Boston Marathon attack happened. You can go see the people who lost their legs or go to the funerals of the victims who were, killed from this. This is not something that, is up to question. So social media, I think, plays on some of that in a negative fashion. But overall, I think it's a good thing. I also think, overall, it's not something that the government can necessarily, nor should it, come in and try to regulate. I think norms can develop within these communities over time, and it can regulate themselves to some extent. You saw that with the Navy shooter attack, the Navy Yard shooter. Reddit actually shut down a discussion that started to go in a similar direction to what happened with the Marathon bombing. So again, it doesn't have to be regulated. People can, to some extent, recognize the stuff for themselves.
Well, thank you all. This has been really terrific. Thank you all for being here, and thank you especially to Professor Krause.
Thank you very much. All right.
But I don't know how live the mic is.
Just in case I start swearing.
That's right. I'll take it. I'll give it to them.